The Damnation Game, Part 1, Terra Incognita. Hell is the place of those who have denied. They find there what they planted and what dug, a lake of spaces and a wood of nothing, and wander there and drift and never cease wailing for substance. W.B. Yeats, The Hourglass. The air was electric the day the thief crossed the city, certain that tonight, after so many weeks of frustration, he would finally locate the card player. It was not an easy journey. 85% of Warsaw had been leveled, either by the months of mortar bombardment that had preceded the Russian liberation of the city, or by the program of demolition the Nazis had undertaken before their retreat. Several sectors were virtually impassable by vehicle, mountains of rubble still nurturing the dead like bulbs ready to sprout as the spring weather warmed, clogged the streets. Even in the more accessible districts, the once elegant facades swooned dangerously, their foundations growling. But after almost 3 months of plying his trade here, the thief had become used to navigating this urban wilderness. Indeed, he took pleasure in its desolate splendor, its perspectives tinged lilac by the dust that still settled from the stratosphere, its squares and parkways so unnaturally silent. The sense he had, trespassing here, that this was what the end of the world would be like. A few landmarks remained by which the traveler could chart his route. The gasworks beside the Poniatowski Bridge, the zoo, the clock tower of Central Station. These and a handful of other pockmarked tributes to Warsaw's civic beauty survived, their trembling presence poignant even to the thief. This wasn't his home. He had no home, nor had for a decade. He was a nomad and scavenger. Soon, when he'd recovered energies depleted in his recent wanderings, it would be time to move on. But while the first signs of spring murmured in the air, he lingered here, enjoying the freedom of the city. He was safer here than the true citizens of Warsaw, the few bewildered survivors of the Holocaust who were gradually beginning to filter back into the city, looking for lost homes, lost faces. They scrabbled in the wreckage, or stood on street corners listening to the dirge of the river, and waited for the Russians to round them up in the name of Karl Marx. New barricades were being established every day. The curfews and checkpoints did little to hobble the thief, however. He held identification papers of every kind, some forged, most stolen. What they lacked in credibility he made up for with repartee and cigarettes, both of which he possessed in abundance. They were all a man needed to feel a lord of creation. And such creation! No need here for either appetite or curiosity to go unsatisfied. The profoundest secrets of body and spirit were available to anyone with the itch to see. Games were made of them. Only the previous week the thief had heard tell of a young man who played the ancient game of cups and ball. Now you see it, now you don't, with 3 buckets and a baby's head. Half a loaf of bread could purchase you a refugee girl to be used and reused in the covering darkness, their complaints unheard or silenced by a bayonet when they lost their charm. A boys' brothel had been opened up in the Zoliborz district. Here, in an underground salon hung with salvaged paintings, one could choose from chicks of 6 or 7 up, all fetchingly slimmed by malnutrition and tight as any connoisseur could wish. It was very popular with the officer class, but too expensive, the thief had heard it muttered, for the non-commissioned ranks. Lenin's tenets of equal choice for all did not stretch, it seemed, to pederasty. Sport of a kind was more cheaply available. Dog fights were a particularly popular attraction that season. He'd made a tidy profit one night by putting his money on a runty but cunning terrier who'd bested a dog 3 times its size by chewing off its opponent's testicles. And if, after a time, your taste for dogs or boys or women palled, there were more esoteric entertainments available. In a crude amphitheater dug from the debris of the bastion of Holy Mary, the thief had seen an anonymous actor single-handedly perform Goethe's Faust, parts 1 and 2. Though the thief's German was far from perfect, the story was familiar enough for him to follow the action. The pact with Mephisto, the debates, the conjuring tricks, and then, as the promised damnation approached, despair and terrors. 2 days later, he had gone back to see the play again, or at least to speak to the actor. But there would be no encores. The performer's enthusiasm for Goethe had been interpreted as pro-Nazi propaganda. The thief found him hanging naked from a telegraph pole. His feet had been eaten at, and his eyes taken out by birds. His torso was riddled with bullet holes. His mouth gaped, but the birds had taken his tongue as well. No loss. There were far more rewarding diversions. The women the thief could take or leave, and the boys were not to his taste. But the gambling he loved, and always had. Since his adolescence, it had been his one true vice. It was the indulgence he had become a thief to fund. Before the war, he'd played in casinos across Europe. He looked back on those years as something irretrievable, slipping further away with every breath. The sense of loss changed, however, when he heard about the card player. Mamoulian, they called him, who, it was said, never lost a game, and who came and went in this deceitful city like a creature who was not, perhaps, even real. But then, after Mamoulian, everything changed. Beyond the general picture he garnered from the grapevine, there were few specifics. He knew he would have to find and interrogate a man who would actually face the paragon across a gaming table before he could begin to separate truth from speculation. It took 2 weeks to find such a man. His name was Konstantin Vasiliev, a second lieutenant who, it was said, had lost everything he had playing against Mamoulian.
The laws of chance are nothing to him. Mamoulian isn't like you or me.
The Russian was broad as a bull. The thief felt dwarfed by him. But while some big men nurture spirits expansive enough to fill their anatomies, Vasiliev seemed almost empty. If he ever possessed such virility, it was now gone. Left in the husk was a fidgety child.
How could a man always win without having some power over the cards?
So what's his method? How does he cheat?
Cheat? He doesn't cheat. I've played cards all my life with the best and the worst. I've seen every trick a man can pull, and I tell you now, he was clean.
The luckiest player gets defeated once in a while. The laws of chance.
A look of innocent amusement crossed Vasiliev's face, and for a moment the thief glimpsed the man who'd occupied this fortress before his fall from sanity.
To Mamoulian, winning is beauty. It is like life itself.
The vacant eyes returned to tracing the rough grain of the floorboards.
To Mamoulian, winning is beauty. It is like life itself.
It was strange talk, and it made the thief uneasy. He eyed Vasiliev across the table. Once, the thief thought, this man had been capable of certainty, of action, perhaps even of heroism. Now all that noble stuff had been siphoned off. The champion was reduced to a sniveling rag. He inwardly applauded the brilliance of Mamulian's victory. He had always hated heroes.
One last question.
The thief stood up.
Do you know where he is?
He made to pocket the half-empty packet of cigarettes that lay on the table between them.
Wait.
Vasiliev reached for the pack before it slid out of sight.
Yuranovsky Square. Do you know it? Take my advice. You will only suffer humiliation, perhaps death.
How do I find him once I get there? I don't even know what he looks like.
You won't need to find him. If he wants you to play, he'll find you.
The next night, the first of many such nights, the thief had gone looking for the card player. After a week, he went back to find Vasiliev. The Russian was dead. His body, throat slit from ear to ear, had been found the previous day, floating face down in one of the sewers the army was clearing in Vola. He was not alone. There had been 3 other corpses with him, all slaughtered in a similar fashion, all set alight and burning like fire ships as they drifted down the tunnel on a river of excrement. One of the soldiers who had been in the sewer when the flotilla appeared told the thief that the bodies had appeared to float in the darkness. For a breathless moment, it had been like the steady approach of angels.
Cannot be. Oh! Junior! Help me! Oh!
Then, of course, the horror. Extinguishing the burning corpses, their hair, their backs, then turning them over, and the face of Vasiliev caught in a torch beam, carrying a look of wonder, like a child in awe of some lethal conjurer. The bodies, once identified, had been buried in Warsaw, except for Second Lieutenant Vasiliev, whose war record demanded less cursory treatment. Plans were afoot to ship his body back to Mother Russia, where he would be buried with state honors in his hometown. Mysteriously, the body disappeared. Nobody would admit responsibility. Had the corpse simply been shipped out to some new posting? Vasiliev's death merely served to intensify the thief's curiosity. Mamulian's arrogance fascinated him. Here was a man who made his living off the weakness of others, and yet had become so insolent that he dared to murder, or have murdered on his behalf, those who crossed him. The thief became jittery with anticipation. He wandered in Muranovsky Square like a man in love. Tonight, the air was electric, and he would find the card player, he was sure. He had been sure since he woke that morning. He walked through 2 checkpoints without being challenged. Tonight, he was inevitable. His place here, breathing the scented lilac air, stars glimmering at his zenith, was unassailable. He felt static run in the hairs on the back of his hand and smiled. Not far away, the Vistula, gross with rain and meltwater, roared towards the sea. He was no less irresistible.
You want?
He turned to face his interrogator. The figure in front of him was smiling a welcome. It was a woman, despite the rasp of the voice, dressed in oversized trousers tied with a rope, but otherwise naked. Her head was shaved, her toenails lacquered. The sheened globes of her breasts were perfect. He felt his fists opening, the palms tingling to touch them. but perhaps his appraisal of her body was too frank. He glanced back up at her face to see if she was still smiling. She was, but his gaze lingered on her face this time. He realized that what he'd taken to be a smile was a permanent fixture. Her lips had been sliced off, exposing gums and teeth. There were ghastly scars on her cheeks, the remains of wounds that had severed the tendons and induced a rictus that teased her mouth open.
You want the cards?
Yes. I want the cards.
She nodded, turned away from him, and started across the square. She led him to the remains of a large house on the opposite side. Its ravaged interior, once impressive, still stood. There was even a doorway in it, though no door. Through it, the light of a bonfire flickered. She led him over the mounds of brick and fallen roof timbers. He followed, sweating. The fire spat. He glanced round at it and glimpsed somebody on the far side. The woman stopped.
Your coat.
She stretched out her hands to help him shoulder it off. Once done, she stepped out of his eye line, and the object of his long search came into view. It was not Mamoulian, however, that took his eye at first. It was the carved wooden altarpiece set against the wall behind him, a Gothic masterwork, which blazed even in the gloom with gold and scarlet and blue. Spoils of war, the thief thought. He looked at the figure seated in front of the triptych. The card player's face was bright but unstable.
So, Pilgrim, you found me. Finally.
You found me, surely.
You fancy a game or two, I hear. Is that right?
The thief smiled.
Why not?
He tried to sound as nonchalant as possible, though his heart was beating a double tattoo in his chest. He felt pitifully unprepared. Sweat glued his hair to his forehead. There was brick dust on his hands and muck under his nails. "I look," he squirmed, "like the thief I am." By contrast, Mamoulian was a picture of propriety. There was nothing in the sober clothes, the black tie, the gray suit, that suggested a profiteer. He appeared, this legend, like a stockbroker. His face, like his dress, was unrepentantly plain. He looked 60 or thereabouts, cheeks slightly hollowed, nose large, aristocratic, brow wide and high. He sat upright in his chair, and his agile hands fanned and gathered a pack of cards with loving familiarity. Only his eyes belonged to the thief's dream of him. No stockbroker ever had such glacial, unforgiving eyes.
I hoped you'd come, Pilgrim. Sooner or later.
Am I late?
We'll see. You know, of course, that I play for very high stakes.
I heard.
If you wish to withdraw now before we go any further, I would understand perfectly.
Don't you want me to play?
On the contrary, I very much want you to play. But I am not sympathetic to those who do not pay their debts.
You mean the lieutenant?
I know no lieutenant. I know only gamblers like myself. A few are good, most are not. They all come here to test their mettle, as you have.
He had picked up the pack again, and it was moving in his hands as if the cards were alive. 52 moths, fluttering in the queasy light, each one marked a little differently from the last. They were almost indecently beautiful, their glossy faces the most unflawed thing the thief had set eyes on in months.
I want to play.
Then sit down, Pilgrim.
Almost soundlessly, the woman had set a chair behind him. As he sat down, the thief met Mamoulian's gaze. Was there anything in those joyless eyes that intended him harm? There was nothing there to fear. He unbuttoned the cuffs of his shirt and folded the sleeves back in preparation for play. After a time, the game began. Part 2. Asylum. The devil is by no means the worst that there is. I would rather have dealings with him than with many a human being. He honors his agreements much more promptly than many a swindler on earth. To be true, when payment is due, he comes on the dot, just as 12 strikes, fetches his soul, and goes off home to hell like a good devil. He's just a businessman, as is right and proper. J.N. Nestroy, Hollenangst. After serving 6 years of his sentence at Wandsworth Prison, Marty Strauss was used to waiting. He had waited to wash and shave himself every morning. He had waited to eat, to defecate. He had waited for freedom. He hadn't been expecting to get it the afternoon that parole officer called him into his office to meet Mr. Toy.
My employer is a man by the name of Joseph Whitehead. I don't know if that means anything to you.
The name rang a faint bell in Marty's head, and it had some scandalous association, but it was tantalizingly vague, and he had no time to puzzle it through. Mr. Toy was in full flight.
If you haven't heard of Mr. Whitehead, you're doubtless familiar with the Whitehead Corporation, which he founded. It's one of the largest pharmaceutical empires in Europe. Although Mr. Whitehead is now in his 60s, he still keeps control of the corporation. He's a self-made man, you understand? He's dedicated his life to its creation. He chooses, however, not to be as visible as he once was. He shuns publicity almost completely. And since his wife's death, he has little taste for the social arena. Instead, he chooses to
A front-page photograph suddenly developed in Strauss's head. A man with a hand thrown up against the glare of a flashbulb. Sharing the unwelcome attention was a woman whose beauty astonished even in the unflattering light. The wife of whom Toy spoke, perhaps.
When the time came to employ a new personal bodyguard, it was Mr. Whitehead's decision to seek a suitable candidate amongst men coming up for parole, rather than going through the usual agencies.
He can't mean me, Strauss thought.
He's looking for a man who is nearing the end of his sentence. Your case was brought to my attention. I may call you Martin?
Usually it's Marty.
While the waiting had come to seem easy, the interviews never had. Marty remembered that afternoon meeting with a mixture of joy and loathing. Toy had asked him about the theft, of course, and about his wife, Charmaine. That was the embarrassing part. No, it was over. He had no attachments. They surely had the details filed away somehow anyway. Mr. Toy probably knew more about what Charmaine was doing, and with whom, than he did. Toy always spoke to him in that cool yet intimate tone, the same one he used when he delivered Marty to his long, airy room in one of the wings of Joseph Whitehead's mansion.
Well, this is yours. It's a bit bare at the moment, so do whatever you want with it. Have you got photographs?
Not really.
Well, I'll get something on the walls. Now, there are some books. I'll show you the layout sometime next week when you're settled in. There's a video up here and another downstairs. Again, Joe doesn't really have much interest in it, so help yourself.
So here he waited. He had met Whitehead, of course, the night he arrived, in fact. An old man, to be sure, but still strong. His large frame filled the darkening window. Marty could sense his power across the broad expanse of the room.
Mr. Strauss, welcome.
Behind Whitehead, the curtains were still open, and through the window the floodlights suddenly came on, illuminating the piercing green of the lawns for a good 200 yards. It was a conjurer's trick, the sudden appearance of this sward, but Whitehead ignored it. He walked towards Marty.
I'm Joseph Whitehead. Welcome to the sanctuary.
Thank you.
I want you to make this house your home, Strauss. Become familiar with it. There are one or two places which will be out of bounds to you. Toy will tell you where. Please observe these constraints. The rest of the place is at your disposal.
Marty nodded.
Tomorrow we'll take a walk around the place, you and I. Show you the fences, introduce you to Bella and the others. Bella is an Alsatian. Wonderful beasts. Do you know them? You will be great friends.
Marty had noticed the fences when he arrived. As secure as Wandsworth Prison the place is, he had thought, driving up from the road. Luther, the chauffeur, didn't want to talk about them, or anything else for that matter. What was it that Whitehead was keeping out with these lethal defenses? Dirt peddlers? A fortress against a tide of scandal and shit? If so, it was an elaborate way of going about it.
You must make me your world, Mr. Strauss. My preservation, my sanity, my smallest comfort must be uppermost in your mind every waking moment. If it is, I promise you freedoms you never dreamt of experiencing. The kind of freedoms that are only in the gift of very wealthy men. If not, I will put you back in prison with your record book irredeemably spoiled. Understand me?
I understand.
Sweet dreams.
Sitting on his bed, Marty wondered if it wasn't simply monstrous egotism. If it was, he thought, that would make my job a lot easier. It took several weeks for Marty to understand fully the rhythm of the Whitehead household. Like the benign dictatorship it was, the shape of each day was defined absolutely by Whitehead's plans and whims. As the old man had told Marty that first day, the house was a shire to him. His worshippers came daily to touch the hem of his opinion. Some of their faces he recognized. Captains of industry, 2 or 3 government ministers, one of whom had recently left office in disgrace. Was he coming here for forgiveness or retribution? Marty wondered. Many people Marty knew by sight but couldn't name. Even more he didn't know at all. He was introduced to none of them. The week saw his physique improve. The strict regime of exercise he had set for himself that first night began as a torment, but after a few days the exertion began to bear fruit. He got up at 5:30 each morning and took a run around the grounds. After a week of following the same circuit, he altered the route, which allowed him to explore the estate at the same time as exercising. It was a joy. Not just the exploration and the freedom, but the reacquaintance with nature. He loved being up to watch the sun rise, and it was almost as though he was running to meet it, as though dawn was for him and him alone, a promise of light and warmth and life to come. Systematically, he began to put names to the faces that appeared regularly for dinner parties at the house, Whitehead's most trusted advisers. Marty was sometimes excused on these occasions. Toy, of course, was regularly in evidence. There was also a lawyer called Ottaway, a thin, well-dressed man of 40 or so, who spoke with that air of the legal fan dancer that Marty knew well. It brought back sour memories. There was another called Kurtzinger, a sober-suited individual with an excruciating taste in ties, and a worse one in colognes, who seemed more benign. On one occasion, celebrating some deal that had been made, Kurtzinger had slipped a cigar into the pocket of Marty's jacket. After that, Marty would have forgiven him anything. Then there was a swarthy troll of a man named Dwoskin. Here was Cassius to Toy's Brutus. His immaculate pale gray suits, his meticulously folded handkerchiefs, the precision of his every gesture, all spoke of an obsessive whose rituals of tidiness were designed to counter the excess of his physicality. But there was more, an undercurrent of danger about the man which Marty's years in Wandsworth had taught him to be alive to. In fact, it was there with the others, too. Beneath Ottaway's frigid exterior and Kurtzinger's sugar coating, there were men who were not entirely savory. If Whitehead noticed any change in his manner or physique, no comment was made. But Toy, on one of his trips up to the house from London, immediately registered the change in him. Marty noted an alteration in Toy, too, but for the worse. It wasn't possible to comment on how weary he looked. Marty felt their relationship wouldn't yet allow for such familiarity. There were other mysteries here besides Toy's decline. The upper floor of the main house, where Whitehead had his suite of rooms, was entirely out of bounds to him. He wasn't sure when it was he first felt there was someone living there, watching him, someone he hadn't met. And then, one morning, she was waiting at the Dovecote for him as he made the long curve back towards the house, and he knew at once he had been right. This was the cautious observer at the upper window. It was barely 7:15 in the morning, and still chilly. She'd been waiting a while, to judge by the flush on her cheeks and nose. Her eyes were shining with cold.
Hello, Marty. You don't know me, I'm Keris. It's Welsh.
You're the one from upstairs.
Yes. You didn't mind me spying, did you?
Why should I?
She extended a slim, gloveless hand to the stone of the Dovecote.
It's beautiful, isn't it? It's one of the biggest dovecotes in England. Did you know that?
Marty shook his head. He couldn't help but stare at her. She suddenly seemed embarrassed, and she turned quickly into the open air.
Maybe you'll show me the rest of the grounds.
Perhaps.
Tomorrow? It's strange being in the house with no one to talk to.
It's Papa's house. We just live in it. Don't tell anyone about our meeting.
Are you all right?
I have to hurry. I'm wanted.
Two days later, about 11:30 at night, Marty got a summons from Whitehead. He found the old man in the study, sitting in the leather chair in front of the window. On the table beside him was an empty bottle of vodka and an almost empty glass. He didn't turn when Marty knocked and entered, but simply addressed Marty from his vantage point in front of the floodlit lawn.
I think it's time I gave you more leash, Strauss. You've done a fine job so far. I'm pleased.
Thank you, sir.
Bill Toy will be up here overnight tomorrow, and so will Luther. Oh, this might be an opportunity for you to go down to London. I've had Luther sort out a vehicle for you, and there's some money on the desk for you.
Thank you, sir.
It was 8 weeks since he'd arrived at the estate, and here, at last, was a tentative signal that his place was secure. Whitehead's hand reached out for the glass of vodka, and Marty thought he was going to turn and look at him. He didn't. The interview was apparently over. It was many months since Whitehead had gone to bed sober. And yet he took no pleasure in drunkenness. He loathed putting his spinning head down on the pillow and hearing his thoughts whine in his ears. But he feared the fear more. Now, as he sat watching the lawn, a fox stepped across the threshold of the floodlights, blanched by the brilliant illumination, and stared at the house. Its brilliance lent it perfection. It waited a moment only, and then it was gone. Whitehead watched the spot it had disappeared from for a long while. There had been a time when he had been a fox, thin and sharp, a night wanderer. But things had changed. Providence had been bountiful, dreams had come true. The fox, always a shape-changer, had grown fat and easy. The world had changed too. It had become a geography of profit and loss. Distances had shrunk to the length of his command. He had forgotten, with time, his previous life. But of late he remembered it more and more. And forward, from here, that was a journey into a hopeless place, where no signpost would point him left or right, nor would there be hill or tree or habitation to mark the way. Such a terrible place. But he wouldn't be there alone. In that nowhere, he would have a companion. And when, in the fullness of time, he set eyes on that land and its tenant, he would wish, oh Christ, how he would wish that he had stayed a fox. Anthony Breer, the razor eater, returned to his tiny flat in the late afternoon, made himself instant coffee in his favorite cup, then sat down at the table in the failing light and started to tie himself a noose. He had seen hanged people aplenty. Only photographs, of course, in a book he'd stolen from work about war crimes. Soviet documents on Nazi atrocities. There were pictures of the burnt-out ruins of Chekhov's cottage in Istra, and others of the desecration of the Tchaikovsky residence. But mostly, and more importantly, there were photographs of the dead. Some of them heaped in piles, others lying in bloody snow, frozen solid. Children with their skulls broken open, people lying in trenches, shot in the face, others with swastikas carved into their chests and buttocks. But to the razor eater's greedy eyes, the best photographs were of people being hanged. There was one Breer looked at very often. It pictured a handsome young man being strung up from a makeshift gallows. The photographer had caught him in his last moments, staring directly at the camera, a wan and beatific smile on his face. That was the look Breer wanted them to find on his face when they broke down the door of this very room and found him suspended up there, pirouetting in the breeze from the hallway. His only anxiety was the confession. He wanted to say something about the children, just so they'd know, the people who found him and photographed him, that this wasn't a nobody they were staring at, but a man who had done the worst things for the best possible reasons. He tied and retied the noose, determined to make as professional a job of it as possible. There would be an autopsy, of course. Maybe that was the best confession after all. No use to find the right words, because what were words anyway? No, they'd find all they needed to know if they just looked inside him. Find the story of the lost children. Find the glory of his martyrdom. And they'd know once and for all that he was from the tribe of the razor eaters.
Let me see now. Oh, yes. Yes, merciful Father.
It was almost dark by the time he finished. Time to go, he thought. He positioned the chair carefully, stepped up onto it, and reached for the rope. The noose was, if anything, an inch or two too high. and he had to go up on tiptoe to fit it snugly round his neck. But he fitted it securely with a little maneuvering. Once he had the knot pulled tight against his skin, he said his prayers and kicked over the chair. His hands betrayed him at this vital juncture, springing up from his sides and tearing at the rope as it tightened. His bowels gave out into his trousers, and his penis stiffened without a lustful thought in his popping head. His heels dug at the air looking for purchase, all suddenly not his own, all too hot for their own preservation to hold still and die. Quite abruptly, sight went out, and death was on him. No, not quite. A cluster of unwelcome sensations swarmed over him, intruding on the privacy of his death. A breeze warmed his face, assaulting his nerve ends. An ungracious breath choked him, pressing into his flaccid lungs without the least invitation. He fought the resurrection, but his savior was insistent. The room began to reassemble itself around him. Somebody said his name. He shook his head, but the voice came again, and this time his upturned eyes found a face. And oh, it was not over. Far from it. He had not been delivered into heaven or hell. Neither would dare boast the face he was now staring up into. It was Manoulian.
Anthony! Anthony! I thought I'd lost you, Anthony. Oh, you bit your tongue in your enthusiasm, but it will heal. Everything heals given time. You lie there. I'll make some tea, shall I? Just the thing. You should have called me, Anthony. I told you before, I am the last true European. You are the last of the razor eaters. We should try to help each other.
There was a time, of course, when the European had done just that, keeping Breer from capture on 2 or 3 occasions, celebrating his trespasses, teaching him that to be a razor eater was a worthy estate. Breer wasn't so trusting that he didn't suspect a time would come when the last European, "Please call me Mr. Mamoulian," he used to say, but Breer could never pronounce that comical name, when this strange companion would ask for help in his turn. In dying, he had hoped to escape the debt ever being called in. The longer he'd been away from Mr. Mamoulian, it was 6 years since they'd last met, the more the memory of the man had come to frighten Breer. In fact, it was as if Mamoulian had never quite gone, as though he'd left a sliver of himself in Breer's head to polish up his picture when time dirtied it, to keep a watch on his servant's every deed. Though Marty had imagined otherwise, Caris wasn't at the dinner party. There were few freedoms left to her. Refusing her father's invitations to dinner was one of them. She had endured an afternoon of his sudden tears, his just as sudden accusations. She was weary of his kisses and his doubts. So tonight she had given herself a larger fix than usual, greedy for forgetfulness. Now all she wanted to do was lie down and bask in oblivion. Even as she lay her head on the pillow, something or someone touched her. She came round again, startled. There was nobody there. She could still feel the nerve endings of the nape of her neck tingle where the touch had seemed to come, responding anemone-like to the intrusion. Sitting up, she wondered where her runner was. Probably at that dinner party with the rest of Papa's court. They'd like that, having him amongst them to condescend to. She didn't think of him as an angel any longer. After all, he had a name now, and a history. Toy had told her everything he knew. Martin Francis Strauss, a man with green-gray eyes and a scar on his cheek, and hands that were very eloquent, like an actor's hands, except that she didn't think that he'd be very good at professional deceit. His eyes betrayed him too easily. Then the touch came again, and this time she distinctly felt fingers catching at her nape, as though the bone of her spine had been pinched so lightly. It was an absurd illusion, but too persuasive to be dismissed. Was it just the result of a bad fix? She'd never had problems before. The heroin that Luther bought her from his Stratford suppliers was always of the highest quality. Papa could afford it. Lie down, she told herself. Even if you can't sleep, lie down. Karis did not hear the dogs begin to bark. Marty did. At first, just a few were barking, somewhere off to the southeast of the house. But the call was almost immediately taken up by a volley of others. He got up boozily from in front of the dead television and went to the window. The wind had got up. It had probably knocked down some dead branches which had disturbed the dogs. He flipped the video to surveillance and checked the closed-circuit cameras one by one. 3 cameras were out of action in all.
Shit.
He took his anorak off the hook beside the back door and went outside. If a tree were down, he'd have had a clearing-up job in his hands. It was odd that the alarms hadn't started, though. The house fell away behind him. The lit windows diminished. Eventually, he reached the fence where he approximated the noise of the dogs to have come from. All the lights in either direction were working. There was no visible sign of any disturbance. Yet, something about the scene felt odd. The lights behind him flickered. He turned. At first he thought it was simply a trick of the wind, but no. The lights were actually dimming. Even as they faded, along the perimeter to his right, the dogs began again, anger and panic in their voices. He started to run in the direction of the din. As he went, the lights came back on again, but they were set too infrequently along the fence to offer much reassurance. Between them, patches of darkness sprawled. Light, darkness, light, darkness. Ahead, a tableau resolved itself. An intruder was standing on the far side of a light pool thrown down by one of the lamps. The dogs were everywhere, at his heels, at his chest, snapping and tearing at him. The man was standing upright, legs apart, while they milled around him.
Stand! Bella, stand! So, stand!
Keep them off me.
Stand! So, good dog.
Get them away.
The intruder was left standing in a ring of watchful dogs. Curiously, despite the venom in their attack, and their tails were between their legs. The man looked more like a derelict than a would-be assassin. His plain dark jacket was torn in a dozen places, and there were bites all over his body. In some places, particularly his legs, pieces of his flesh had been ripped away. The middle finger of his left hand had been bitten through, and was depending by a thread of sinew. Marty was amazed that he was standing upright. The dogs were itching to finish their wounded victim off, but the derelict wouldn't grant them a sign of his fear. He only had eyes for Marty, and those eyes were pinpricks in livid white. The intruder said nothing, simply stared. His agony, Marty knew, must be acute. The skull behind the lax and waxen flesh was severe. The features set in it were used and weary, tragic even. His suffering was only apparent in the greasy sheen of his skin and the fixedness of his facial muscles. His stare had the stillness of a hurricane's eye and its menace.
Come back to the house with me.
I loathe dogs. We both do.
Marty hadn't time to think clearly about what the man was saying. He just wanted to stop the situation from escalating again. Blood loss had surely weakened the man.
You'll bleed to death, for God's sake. If you don't come of your own accord, I'll take you.
No.
The intruder raised his injured hand to chest height and glanced down at it.
I don't need your kindnesses. Thank you.
He bit down on the sinew of the mutilated finger as a seamstress might through a thread. The discarded joints fell to the grass. Then he clenched the seeping hand into a fist and thrust it into his ravaged jacket.
Christ almighty. What's happening now?
Suddenly, the lights along the fence were flickering again, only this time they went out altogether. Something lit the scene. There was neither electricity nor starlight. The intruder was the source. He'd begun to burn with a faint luminescence. Light was dripping from his fingertips and oozing from the bloody holes in his coat. It enveloped his head in a flickering gray halo that consumed neither flesh nor bone, the light licking out of mouth and eyes and nostrils. A look of anguish slid across the fabricator's face. A drool of bloody darkness spilled from his eyes, leaving only bright worms of fire to trace his skull. Then they, too, went out. And just as suddenly as the illusions had appeared, they were gone. And there was just a torn man standing behind the humming fence. Some of the lights were coming back on again, their illumination so flat it drained any last vestige of magic. Marty looked at the bland flesh, the empty eyes, the sheer drabness of the figure in front of him, and believed none of it.
Tell Joseph that I was here.
Who are you?
Just tell him.
Marty nodded. He had no courage left in him.
Just tell him, and then go home.
Home?
Away from here. Out of harm's way.
He turned from Marty and the dogs, and as he did so, the lights faltered and failed for several dozen yards in either direction. When they came back on again, the magician had gone. Part 3. Deuce. Deuce, noun. The two at dice or cards. Tennis, state of score. 40 all, games all, at which either party must gain 2 consecutive points or games to win. Deuce, noun. Plague, mischief, the devil. Less than a week after the incident at the fence, the first hairline cracks began to appear in the Whitehead Empire. They rapidly widened. In the space of a few days, there were more visitors to the estate than Marty had ever seen before. Much of their debating, as ever, was lost on Marty, but it was clear from the snippets he overheard that the corporation was facing no explicable emergency. There were murmurs of secret government interference, of a conspiracy of the competition. The paranoia in the house knew no bounds. Whitehead had reacted with passivity to Marty's description of the strange intruder. Of course, Marty had only offered a carefully doctored version of what had actually happened, about his hearing the dogs and about the chase and the brief conversation he had had with the man at the fence. Just the plainest outline of events, and those few words, "Tell him that I was here." On the second Sunday, 11 days into the crisis, Marty was summoned to the library. Whitehead was there, looking somewhat tired perhaps, but not substantially cowed by the enormous pressure he was under.
You believe in God, Martin?
I don't pray, if that's what you mean.
Not even before your trial? A quick word with the Almighty?
I don't remember exactly. I suppose I must have said something then, yes. Much good it did me.
Here. I want you to take this gun. Pick it up, it won't bite. Have no hesitation, Strauss. The man is lethal.
Yes, sir.
And the devil, Marty.
What, sir?
The devil. Did you ever pray to him? Well, did you?
Once or twice.
In the 2.5 months Marty had now been at the sanctuary, Whitehead had been an iceberg. Now he had to think about revising that description. Today he glimpsed another man altogether, inarticulate, alone, talking of God and prayer. Not just God. It had been that final question, the one he'd thrown away so carelessly. And the devil, Marty? The sincerity was already gone from Whitehead's voice that afternoon when he talked to Marty about Karis.
There's a good dog, Bella. There you go, girl. Give them all a good run tomorrow, will you, Strauss? You've been seeing something of my daughter, I gather. She seems stable much of the time, but essentially that's a performance. I'm afraid she's not well, and hasn't been for several years. Of course, she's seen the best psychiatrists money can buy, but I'm afraid it's done no good.
Are you telling me not to see her?
No, not at all. The companionship may be good for her, but bear in mind she's a highly disturbed girl. Don't take her pronouncements too seriously. Half the time she doesn't know what she's saying.
He wondered about what the old man had said, lying on his bed in the servants' wing. Karis had been in his room when he got back, dressed in jeans and a sweater, barefoot. She had talked to him about herself for a long while, and they had made love. She was aware that she felt things that other people didn't, and in the last few weeks she could feel something in the house. She spoke of dreams, horrible things, and of odd thoughts in her head coming to her out of nowhere. And once, when they were locked in each other's arms, he thought he saw, no, he was sure he saw, another pair of eyes within her own staring out at him, black eyes swiveling in a gray head. It was something dredged up from the bottom of the sea, some primeval genus that viewed him. He knew this to his marrow, with hatred in its bowels. The hallucination had lasted 2 heartbeats only, but long enough for him to glance down her body and up again to meet the same vile gaze. Then her eyelids fluttered, and she was herself again. Mamoulian felt sick. She wasn't easy prey, this woman, despite his sentimental claim upon her psyche. But then her strength was to be expected. She was Whitehead's stock, peasant breed, thief breed, cunning and dirty. Though she couldn't know precisely what she was doing, she'd fought him with the very sensuality he most despised. He sat in the bare room, in the bare house he had bought for himself and Breer, and tried to forget the turbulence he'd experienced, the look in Strauss's eyes as he had stared up at the girl. Had the thug glimpsed, perhaps, the face behind her face? The European guessed so. The memories of Strauss's assaults lingered in the European's entrails. He longed to evacuate them. The sensation shamed and disgusted him. Mamoulian concentrated on the blank wall opposite him, but try as he might to exile the trauma, he still felt the intrusion, the spurting head, the heat of the act. Downstairs, he heard Breer come in or go out, on his way to some atrocity, or home from one. Breer hated the house. It was cold, he complained, and the natives in this part of the city were inhospitable. He was regarded with suspicion as soon as he stepped out of the front door. There were reasons for this. In recent weeks, a smell had begun to linger around him, a sickly, syrupy smell. He doused his body with perfumes, sandalwood in particular, but it did no good. He was almost ashamed to get too close to the pretty ones along beside the schoolyard railing, for fear they'd put their fingers to their noses, making a poo-poo sound, and run off calling him names. When they did that, it made him want to die.
What do you want, Anthony?
If the air in the house was cold, it was even colder in Mamoulian's room. The European seemed to exhale a breath that was mortuary chilled. Breer stood in the doorway. All he could think was, I hate this room.
I want to go.
Go?
Away. The flies bother me. There are so many flies. Why didn't you let me die?
I need you.
But I feel ill.
The work will soon be over.
Breer looked straight at Mamoulian, something he rarely mustered the courage to do. But desperation was a rod at his back.
You mean finding Toy? We won't find him. It's impossible.
Oh, but we will, Anthony. That I insist upon.
Oh, I wish I was dead.
Don't say that. You've got all the freedoms you want, haven't you? You feel no guilt now, do you? Think of it, Anthony. Free to commit your heart's desire to flesh and never be called to regret it. Rest today. Tomorrow we're going to be busy, you and I.
Why?
We're going to visit the pilgrim.
Mamoulian had told him about Whitehead and the house and the dogs. The damage they had done to the European was conspicuous. A finger and a half missing, ugly scars raking palm and face, a thumb that would no longer move properly. His facility with cards was permanently spoiled. It was a long and sorry tale he had told Breer the day he'd returned bloodied from his encounter with the dogs. A history of promises broken and trust despised, of atrocities committed against friendship. The European had wept freely in the telling of it, and Breer had glimpsed the profundity of pain in him.
Please let me go and kill this man for you.
No, Anthony.
I can. I'm not afraid of dogs. I feel no pain. Not now. Not since you came back. I can kill him in his bed.
I'm sure you could. And I will certainly need you to keep the dogs off me.
Oh, I'll tear them apart.
You do that, Anthony. I loathe this species. Always have. You deal with them while I have words with Joseph.
Oh, why bother with him? He's so old.
So am I. Older than I look, believe me. But a bargain is a bargain.
It's hard being the last, needing to do everything properly so that the tribe is remembered.
Breer was trembling. All the glories he'd missed, not being born into a great age. What must that dream time have been like, when the Razor Eaters and the Europeans and all the other tribes held the world in their hands? There would never come such an age again. Mamoulian had said so.
You won't be forgotten.
Oh, I think I will.
The European stood up. He seemed much bigger than Breer remembered him, and darker.
Have a little faith, Anthony. There is so much to look forward to.
Breer felt a touch at the back of his neck. It seemed a moth had alighted there and was stroking his nape with its furred antennae. His head had begun to buzz, as though the flies that beset him had laid eggs in his ears, and they were suddenly hatching. Breer was terrified. Just as he thought he must scream or lose his mind, the European appeared out of the nothingness in front of him, and by the lightning flash of his eclipsed consciousness, Breer saw the man transformed. here was the source of all flies, floating before him more naked than any man had a right to be, naked to the point of not being. Now he spread his good hand towards Breer. In it were bone dice, carved with faces Breer almost recognized, and the last European was crouching and was tossing the dice, faces and all, into the void, while somewhere close by a thing with fire for a head wept and wept, until it seemed they would all drown in tears. From the door of the doghouse, Mamoulian had watched Breer at work. It was an efficient slaughter. The fat man simply opened the cages, and then the throats of the dogs, one by one, using his long-bladed knife. It had been easier than he'd expected. Then Breer went to the back door of the main house, punched out the glass, and reached through and unlocked it, letting Mamoulian into the kitchen. The European had disappeared into the blue gloom of the interior. Breer watched him go, and once his master was out of sight, he entered the sanctuary after him, blood and smiles wreathing his face. Kara stood on the small landing outside Marty's room and listened. From inside there came the sound of steady sleep. She hesitated a moment, unsure whether or not to go in, then slipped down the stairs again, leaving him unwoken. Halfway down the second flight of stairs, she stopped. There was a curious tingle in the darkened hallway, a chill of night air, and more. Perhaps she should just go back upstairs, lock her bedroom door behind her, and find a few pills to while away the hours until the sun came up. It would be so much easier than living the way she was, with every nerve electric. Along the hall towards the kitchen, she caught a movement. A black bulk was framed against the doorway and then was gone. It's just the dark, she told herself, playing tricks. She padded down the last 3 steps and along the corridor to the kitchen. The back door was in line with the kitchen door, and both were open. It was odd, almost shocking, in fact, to see the house exposed to the night. She stepped through from the carpeted hallway onto the cool linoleum and flicked on the light. Then she noticed the broken glass on the floor, and she stopped. A smell, sandalwood, was pricking her nostrils. It was sickly, but what it covered was sicklier still. Her mind divided. Part of it coolly assessed the problem and its solutions, where the phone was, what she must say to Marty when he answered it. Another part, the part that embraced H, that was always frightened, dissolved in panic. There's somebody close. Sandalwood, it said. Somebody lethal in the dark. Rotting in the dark. Then there was a sound behind her. Heavy feet crunched the glass into smaller pieces. She turned to see who it was. And there was a nightmare standing in the doorway with a knife in his hand and a dog skin slung over one shoulder.
I want Marty.
No.
The razor eater slouched towards his heart's desire. He didn't need to touch her. His very proximity was enough to halt her. She contemplated trying to slip by him and out into the hallway, but how far could she get before he caught her? There were 2 basic rules when dealing with mad dogs and psychotics. The first, don't run. The second, show no fear. When he reached out towards her, she tried not to recoil.
I won't let anybody hurt you.
He ran the ball of his thumb across the back of her hand, finding a speck of sweat there and brushing it away.
Oh, will you let me look after you, pretty?
She said nothing. His touch appalled her. Not for the first time, she wished she were not a sensitive. She'd never felt such distress at another's touch.
Oh, I'd like to make you comfortable. Share your secrets. In return, I'll show you my secrets.
He didn't wait for an answer. His hand plunged into the pocket of his stained jacket and was taking out a clutch of razors. Their edges glinted. It was too absurd, like a fairground sideshow, but played without the razzmatazz. He put out his dry tongue and laid the first blade on it. She didn't like this one bit. Razors made her nervous, it always had.
Don't.
It's all right. I am the last of the tribe. You see? All gone.
Extraordinary.
That's not all.
He let go of her hand and started to unbuckle his belt. Oh, Christ, she thought. Stupid, stupid, stupid. His arousal at this exhibition was plain even before he had his trousers down.
I am past pain now. No pain. Whatever I do to myself. The razor eater feels nothing. See?
She saw. His groin was completely shaved, and the region sported an array of self-inflicted adornments, hooks and rings transfixing the fat of his lower belly and his genitals. His testicles bristled with needles.
Touch me!
No, thank you.
The razor eater stood completely still. Only his eyes flickered.
Let her alone!
She knew the voice too well. Her dream guide. Breer hoisted up his trousers like a boy caught masturbating and moved away from Karis, throwing her a conspiratorial glance. Only now did the speaker come into the room. He was taller than she dreamt he'd be, and more doleful.
I'm sorry. Nothing you need ever suffer again.
Listening to his calm voice was mesmerizing. She found it difficult to recall her nightmare. His presence canceled memory.
I think perhaps you should come with me.
Why?
Your father's going to die, Karis. If you stay here, you'll only suffer with him. And there's no need for that.
It was a seductive offer, never to live under the old man's thumb again. Karis glanced at Breer.
Don't be afraid of him. He's nothing and no one. You're safe with me. Now go and get your things, my dear.
She could run away.
She will never leave me. I mean her no harm, and she knows it. I rocked her once in these arms.
Naked was she?
A tiny thing. So vulnerable. She deserved better than him.
Breer said nothing, simply lolled insolently against the wall, peeling dried blood from under his nails with a razor. He was deteriorating faster than the European had anticipated. He'd hoped Breer would survive until all of this chaos was over. But knowing the old man, he'd wheedle and prevaricate, and what should have taken days would occupy weeks, by which time the razor eater's condition would be poor indeed. The European felt weary. Finding and controlling a substitute for Breer would be a drain on his already depleted energies. Presently, Karis came downstairs. In some ways he regretted losing his spy in the enemy camp, but there were too many variables if he didn't take her. For one, she had knowledge of him, deeper knowledge than she was perhaps aware of. She knew instinctively his terrors of the flesh, witnessed the way she had driven him out when she and Strauss had made love together. But there was another reason to take her. Whitehead had said that she was his only comfort. If they took her now, the pilgrim would be alone, and that would be his agony. Mamoulian trusted it would be unbearable.
Don't stand in the doorway, Strauss. Come in.
I know what you told me, sir, about never coming up here, but I was afraid something had happened to you.
I'm alive. All's well.
The dogs...
Are dead, I know. Sit.
Shouldn't I call the police?
There's no need. Here, try the meat, Martin. It's superb. My guest brought it.
No, thank you. I'm not hungry.
Your head's full of questions, no doubt. Please ask away. I'll do my best to answer.
Who are they?
Friends. One of them sat where you're sitting now.
How can I help you if I don't know your enemies from your friends?
You want to help me? Then bury the dogs.
Where's Caris?
She's been taken away, Marty, at my request. Somewhere where her problems can be dealt with in a proper manner.
The drugs?
You must have realized her addiction has worsened considerably in the last few weeks. I had hoped to contain it by giving her enough to keep her content while slowly reducing her supply. I've been stupid. I should have conceded defeat long ago. Then, last night, our visitors, the slaughter of the dogs, I realized how selfish I was, subjecting her to such pressures. It's too late in the day for possessiveness or pride.
I see.
You were fond of her?
Yes. I'd like to visit her.
In time, perhaps, Martin. But rest assured, she's in good hands.
It was no morning for burying dead dogs. The sky was too high and promising. Jets, trailing vapor, crossed to America. The woods budded and winged with life. Still, the work had to be done, however inappropriate. Caris's room had been stripped. He had no idea where she'd gone. The old man had been lying, of course. Marty wasn't even sure he knew where his daughter had gone. Whitehead had always appeared a bit distant. Now he seemed almost paternal. He told Marty to rest, take some time off. He had given him money, lots of it, saying that while the corporation was beset by problems, there was no reason why Marty shouldn't enjoy himself a bit. And would it please him to go down to London for a few days, stay at the club if he liked, play some cards at the Academy Casino? At first Marty hadn't understood, but Whitehead insisted. It made him even more certain that the old man was lying about Caris, but he lacked the courage to press the issue. He finished digging the shallow grave and rolled the bodies of the dogs into it. It rattled on their plastic shrouds, a dry rain. When the filling was done, he patted the soil into a rough mound and went back to the house to wash up. Despite her years on the Sunshine Island, Caris had a healthy sense of reality. Or had, until they took her to that cold, bare house on Caliban Street. There, nothing was certain any more. It was Mamoulian's doing. That, perhaps, was the only thing that was certain. Houses weren't haunted, only human minds. Whatever moved in the air there, or flitted along the bare boards with the dust balls and the cockroaches, whatever scintillated like light on water at the corners of her eyes, it was all of Mamoulian's manufacture.
I hate this place.
Don't be frightened.
I want to see Marty.
I'm afraid that's not possible. You'll have everything you need. Ample supplies of food and heroin.
Please, don't harm him.
Thieves come and thieves go. I can't be responsible for what happens to him.
I'll never forgive you.
Yes, you will.
She remembered acutely this man's revulsion at the sex act. What a pale, sickly thing he was for all his powers. She couldn't bring herself to hate him, though she had reason enough. Only Breer, the fat one, upset her. He would come some days and watch her, his eyes sloppy in his head like partially poached eggs. She told Mamoulian about him, and the next day he didn't linger, just brought the pills and hurried away. The days flowed into one another, and sometimes she didn't remember where she was or how she got there. Sometimes she remembered her name, sometimes not. Once, maybe twice, she tried to think her way to Marty, but he was too far from her. Either that or the house had subdued her powers. Whichever, her thoughts lost their way a few miles from Caliban Street, and she returned there sweating and afraid. She had been in the house almost a week when things took a turn for the worse.
I'd like you to do something for me, Karis. I'd like you to find Mr. Toy. Do you remember Mr. Toy?
Of course she remembered. Not well, but she remembered. His broken nose, those cautious eyes that had always looked at her so sadly.
Let your mind go to him. You know the way.
Why can't you do it?
Because he'll be expecting me. He'll have defenses. And I'm too tired to fight with him at the moment.
You're going to harm him.
That's my business, Karis.
I don't think I want to find him for you.
Wait. Aren't we friends?
No! No, never!
She went up to the bathroom to think this through, locking the door behind her. She knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he'd harm Toy if she led him to the man.
Karis.
He was outside the bathroom door. His proximity made her scalp creep.
You can't make me.
Don't tempt me, Karis.
Suddenly, the European's face loomed in her head.
I knew you before you could walk, Karis. I've held you in my arms often. You've sucked on my thumb. It's no fault of yours or mine that we were parted. Believe me, I could teach you, Karis, such things. Just find Toy for me. Is it so much to ask for all my favors to you? Toy never loved you. Nobody has ever loved you.
That was a lie, and a tactical error. The words were cold water on her sleepy face. She was loved. Marty loved her. The runner. Her runner. Mamoulian sensed his miscalculation.
Don't defy me.
Go to hell.
As you wish.
Mamoulian did not leave his station by the door, however. She felt him close. Was he waiting for her to tire and come out? She wondered. Persuasion by physical violence wasn't his style, surely. Unless he was going to use Breer. And then the pipes began to rumble. Somewhere in the system, a tide was moving. This was his doing somehow, though it seemed a vacuous exercise. The toilet farted again. The smell was noxious.
What's happening?
A gruel of filth had started to seep over the lip of the toilet and dribble onto the floor. Wormy shapes moved in it. She shut her eyes. Something skidded across her foot. She was damned if she was going to open her eyes and give him another sense to assault, but curiosity forced them open. The dribbles from the toilet had become a stream, as if the sewers had backed up and were discharging their contents at her feet. Not simply excrement and water. The soup of hot dirt had bred monsters. Creatures that could be found in no sane zoology. Things that had been fish once, crabs once, fetuses flushed down clinic drains before their mothers could wake to scream. Everywhere in the silt, forsaken stuff, offal and dregs, raised itself on queasy limbs and flapped and paddled towards her.
Make them go away.
Fine toy!
No! Stop it!
A glistening arm was thrown up from the belching bowl and flailed around until its digits fixed on the sink. Then it began to haul itself up, its water-rotted bones rubbery.
Please!
Just say yes!
Yes! Yes! Anything! Yes!
As she spat out the words, the handle of the door moved. She turned her back on the emerging horror and put her weight on the handle at the same time as her other hand fumbled with the key. Behind her, she heard the sound of a body contorting itself to fetch itself free. She turned the key the wrong way, then the right. Sodden fingers snatched at her ankle, but she threw herself out of the bathroom before it could catch her and onto the landing, slamming the door behind her. Mamoulian, his victory won, had gone. After that, she couldn't bring herself to go back into the bathroom. At her request, the razor eater supplied a bucket for her to use, which he brought and took away again with reverence. The European never spoke of the incident again. There was no need. That night she did as he had asked her. She opened up her head and went to look for Bill Toy. And within a matter of minutes she found him. So soon after did the last European.
Six easy, easy.
Not since the halcyon days of his big wins at the casinos had Marty possessed so much money as he did now. £2,000 was no fortune to Whitehead, but it raised Marty to blind heights. Perhaps the old man's story about Karras had been a lie. If so, he'd wheedled the truth out of him in time. Slowy, slowy, catchy monkey, as Fever used to say. Fever had been Marty's cellmate at Wandsworth barely 3 months ago. It seemed like an eternity. He wondered what Fever would say to see Marty now, with money lapping at his feet. The waiter brought the drink to his elbow. Marty tipped him heavily. His reserves were running low. He'd won and lost, and won, then lost, and lost, and lost. The defeats didn't distress him overmuch. It wasn't his money, and as Whitehead had often observed, there was plenty more where that came from. As he got up from his seat, his eyes full of numbers, somebody walked past the door of the roulette room and glanced in before moving on to another game. Fleeting seconds were enough for recognition. When Marty last met that face, it had been ill-shaven and waxen with pain, lit by the floods along the sanctuary fence. Now the man was transformed. No longer the derelict, cornered and anguished. Marty found himself walking towards the door, like a man hypnotized. The waiter was at his side.
Another drink, sir?
Marty led him out of the roulette room and into the corridor.
That man, in the grey suit.
Mr. Mamoulian, sir?
Yes. What do you know about him?
I'm sorry, sir. We're not at liberty to discuss members.
The waiter walked away, leaving Marty with 1,000 questions in his mind. Tired and dizzy with too much drink and too little sleep, Marty decided to call it a night. He'd used the 100 or so left in his wallet to take a taxi back to the estate and leave the car to be picked up another day. He was too drunk to drive. He glanced into the baccarat room. The game was in full swing. The mullion had taken up a station on the far side of the table. The wounded hand was lodged in his jacket pocket out of sight. The wide brow was clear of the least expression. Marty watched him for a full 5 minutes. Not once did the European's eyes flicker from the game in front of him. It was uncanny to see how people kept clear of him, cramming themselves into knots rather than press too close to him at the table side. When he had seen enough, Marty headed back down the corridor and left. The day of the Last Supper, as he was to come to think of it, Marty shaved 3 times, once in the morning and twice in the afternoon. The initial flattery of the invitation had long since faded. He had prayed for some convenient get-out clause, a means by which he could politely escape what he was certain would be an excruciating evening. He had no place in Whitehead's entourage. Their values were not his. Their world was one in which he was no more than a functionary. There could be nothing about him that would give them more than a moment's entertainment. Between 8 and 8:30, the cars had started to arrive at the sanctuary. They were to dine in Whitehead's private rooms at the top of the stairs. When the last of the guests had arrived, Marty switched the floodlights on outside and went up to join them. They were all there, of course. Ottaway, the fan-dancing lawyer, and Dwoskin and Kurtzinger, of course. The familiar faces needed no accounting for. Whitehead introduced the 3 women who sat between the men.
Our guests for tonight. This is my sometime bodyguard, Martin Strauss. Martin, I'd like you to meet Oriana.
Oriana, a woman in her 30s, gave him a slightly crooked smile. Her look seemed to strip him naked from head to foot.
This is Stephanie. And finally, Emily.
Emily looked up at Marty.
We've heard so much about you, haven't we?
She had already drunk too much to judge by her flushed complexion, and Marty noticed that her wine glass had been knocked over, its contents a spreading red stain on the white tablecloth in front of her. She was by far the youngest of the 3 women, and almost winsomely pretty.
Sit down, sit down. Never mind the wine, for God's sake.
Marty took his place beside Kurtzinger. The wine Emily had spilled dribbled off the table, unarrested.
Drink, Martin. It's the best stuff you'll ever swallow, believe me. Where's the liqueur? We haven't finished it, have we? Stephanie, are you hiding it, darling?
Marty had never much liked wine. It was a drink to be sipped and swilled around the mouth, and he had no patience with it. But the bouquet of the glass spoke quality, even to his uneducated nose. It had a richness that made him salivate before he downed a mouthful. And the taste didn't disappoint. It was superb.
Good, eh?
Tasty.
Ah, the boy pronounces it tasty.
We better pass it back over before he downs the lot.
It's all got to go tonight.
All of it?
Yes, everything. One blowout to finish the best of the stuff.
Marty wondered what this was about. They were like a retreating army, razing a place to the ground rather than leave anything for those who followed to occupy. There was no slow savoring of wine going on around the table. The glasses were being filled, guzzled, and refilled as though the tipple were water. The only decoration in the room was a religious triptych in the grand style. Its crucifixion was as violent as any that Marty had ever seen. He felt dislocated from events around him, from the women, the fan dancer, the baleful Christ on the wall behind Whitehead. He looked across at Dwoskin. The lean and trollish little man had taken to fumbling at the zip on the back of Stephanie's dress. She made no objection to the public advance. The glass in the other hand was spilling wine into his lap. He either didn't notice or didn't care. Whitehead caught Marty's eye.
Entertaining you, are we?
Marty wiped the nascent smile off his lips.
Don't you approve?
It's not up to me.
You can relax, Martin. Enjoy yourself.
You want to feel?
It was Emily. She pushed her chair back and was now unbuttoning her blouse. The others fell silent and began to watch. Emily got up and started towards him, naked from the waist up.
Come on.
She took hold of Marty's hand and pressed it against her breast, working it round and round.
Yes, he likes that. I can tell he likes that.
Of course he does. Go on, she's all yours. That's what she's here for.
Yes, go on.
Marty heard the words, but he couldn't make proper sense of them. He pulled his hand off the girl's flesh as if scalded.
Go to hell!
He rose and turned to face Emily. She was standing in front of him, attempting the catch of her skirt. There was something undeniably erotic about her exhibitionism. Marty's trousers felt tight, his head too. Dwoskin's gaze was fixed on Emily's nakedness, Ottaway on Marty. Whitehead was pouring himself a glass of wine.
Stop this!
What's the problem, Marty?
Joke over. What's wrong with you people?
Where's his sense of humor?
Oh, we just want a floor show. What's the harm?
Marty jabbed a finger in Whitehead's direction.
I trusted you.
Oh, no, that was an error then, wasn't it?
Marty didn't wait for Whitehead to call him back. Behind him, Emily had begun to bawl like a baby just woken from a nightmare. He could hear her all the way down the darkened corridor. He hoped to God his jittering limbs would bear him up. He wanted out, into the air, into the night. He reached the kitchen after having fallen only once and opened the back door. He headed off across the lawn, not knowing which direction he was going in, until he thought of the woods. He ran towards them, begging their discretion. Marty had continued to run for a while, and then he had collapsed, his head spinning until at last he'd stuck his fingers as far down his throat as he could and was rewarded with a surge of nausea. It was a filthy, cleansing experience, and he made no effort to control the spasms until there was nothing left to vomit. He walked quietly then, where the trees thickened and the undergrowth, light-starved, thinned. Small animals scuttled ahead of him. Night insects whirred in the grass. He stood still to hear the nocturne better. As he did so, he caught a movement out of the corner of his eye. He looked towards it, seeking focus through the receding corridor of trunks. It was no trick. There was somebody, gray as the trees, standing 30 yards or so from him, now still, now moving again. Concentrating, he fixed the figure in the matrix of shadow and deeper shadow. It was a ghost, surely. So quiet, so casual. Fear ran in his scalp, the prickly heat fear of childhood, the essential fear. They stood in that relationship, ghost and he, for what seemed like several minutes. Certainly a good time passed before he heard a noise that was neither owl nor rodent, filtering between the trees. It had been there all along. He had just failed to interpret it for what it was. Digging. The child in him said, "Bad, leave it be, leave it all be." But he was too curious. He took 2 experimental steps towards the ghost. It made no sign of seeing or hearing him. Taking courage, he advanced a few more steps towards his quarry, and then a few more, close enough to see the ghost in enough detail for recognition. It was Mamoulian. The European was staring down at the earth at his feet. There was obviously somebody digging at Mamoulian's feet. He might have other cohorts in the vicinity. The only safety was in lying doggo and hoping to God that no one had seen him. At length, the digging stopped. And so, as if on an unspoken cue, did the nocturne. It was bizarre. The whole repertoire, insect and animal alike, seemed to hold its breath, aghast. Marty slid down the trunk into crawling position, his ears straining for every clue as to what was going on. He chanced to look. Mamoulian was moving off in what Marty guessed to be the direction of the house. He could see nothing of the digger or the other disciples who were accompanying the European. He heard their passage, however, the brush of their dragging steps. Let them go, he thought. He was past protecting Whitehead. That bargain was defunct. He waited until Mamoulian had woven between the trees and disappeared. Then he counted to 20 and stood up. Pins and needles coruscated his lower legs as he started towards the spot where Mamoulian had lingered. Only then did he realize that his headlong run from the party and the long walk he had taken afterwards had taken him in a semicircle. He was now standing in the place he'd buried the dogs. The grave was open and empty. The black plastic shrouds had been torn apart, their contents unceremoniously removed. Marty stared into the hole, not quite comprehending the joke. What use were dead dogs? There was a movement in the grave. Something shifted beneath the plastic sheets. He stepped back from the edge, his gorge too susceptible for this. A nest of maggots, presumably, or perhaps a worm the size of his arm, grown fat and dog meat. Who knew what hid in the earth? Stephanie had excused herself from the table to go to the bathroom, so she wasn't in the room when Mamoulian and the dogs arrived. Waskin had gone out after Stephanie. He had intended to suggest something outrageous for her to perform on him, something gross for this night of nights. He noticed a faint smell of sewer in the hall, and disgraceful images flickering in the air. And then they were upon him. Marty heard the screams too, though he didn't want to. Even at such a distance, they carried a freight of blind panic that made him clammy. He knelt down in the dirt and stopped his ears. The earth smelled ripe beneath him, and his mind seethed with unwelcome thoughts of lying face up in the ground, dead perhaps, but anticipating resurrection, like a sleeper on the verge of waking, nervous of the day. After a while, the din became intermittent. Soon, he told himself, he must open his eyes, stand up and go back to the house to see the hows and the whys of all this commotion. Soon, but not yet. When the noise in the hallway and on the stairs had long stopped, Stephanie crept to the bathroom door, unlocked it, and peered out. The corridor was in complete darkness now. The lamps had either been turned off or shattered. There was a smell in the air like a bad butcher's shop on a hot day. She slipped off her shoes and started to the top of the stairs. The contents of a handbag were scattered down the steps, and there was something wet underfoot. The cars had all gone from the driveway. The downstairs rooms were all forsaken. She started to go back upstairs to gather up her belongings and leave. As she retraced her steps along the gallery, she heard a soft padding behind her. She turned. There was a dog at the top of the stairs. It had presumably followed her up. She could barely make it out in the bad light. It didn't growl, nor did it wag its tail. It simply hobbled towards her. The butcher's shop was here, on all fours, and with every step it took towards her, she saw more of its condition. The innards that looped from its underside, the decayed face, all teeth and putrescence. She headed towards the bathroom, but it covered the distance between them in 3 strides. Her hand slid down its body as it leaped up at her. She couldn't scream. It was devouring her voice, but her arm thrust up into the cold body and found its spine. Instinct made her grasp it and squeeze, muscle dividing in slimy threads, and the beast let her go. But it was too late. Her other hand cupped her throat. Blood was hitting the carpet with thudding sounds. Death was coming quickly. Too numb to feel pain, she looked around. Whitehead was silhouetted in a distant doorway. Between them stood the dog. Somehow it had got up, or rather its front portion had, and it was dragging itself across the shining carpet towards her. Most of its bulk useless now, its head barely raised from the ground. She raised her arm to signal her presence to Whitehead. If he saw her in the gloom, he made no sign. The dog was still moving, as it would move until its resurrector granted it rest. 1 step, 2 steps. Counting games were a perfect cure for insomnia. 3 steps. 4. Marty was loath to go back into the house, but whatever had happened there was surely over, and he was getting chilly where he knelt. He meandered back across the lawn. He could see the lights of the house somewhere ahead. They burned reassuringly, though he knew such reassurance was delusion. Not every house was a refuge. Sometimes it was safer to be out in the world, under the sky, where no roof could fall on your trusting head. Halfway between house and trees, a jet growled overhead, high up, its lights twin stars. He stood and watched it pass over him at his zenith. Perhaps it was one of the monitoring planes he had read passed perpetually over Europe, 1 American, 1 Russian, their electric eyes scanning the sleeping cities, judgmental twins on whose benevolence the lives of millions depended. The sound of the jet diminished to a murmur, then to silence. Gone to spy on other heads. The sins of England would not prove fatal tonight, it seemed. Part 4. The Thief's Tale. Civilizations do not degenerate through fear, but because they forget that fear exists. Freya Stark, Perseus in the Wind. Marty stood in the hallway and listened for footsteps or voices. There were neither. Few lights burned in the house. He made his way upstairs. The second floor was in darkness, but he found his way along it by instinct, his feet kicking against things damp, things torn. He didn't look down, but made his way towards the white room, anticipation mounting with every step. The door was ajar, and a light, not electric but candle, burned inside. He stepped over the threshold. The table had been overturned and several of the chairs reduced to matchwood. He could see that every bottle of wine in the room had been smashed. The room was pungent with the dregs. Whitehead was standing in the corner of the room. There were splatters of blood on his face, but it was difficult to be certain if it was his. He looked like a man pictured in the aftermath of an earthquake. Shock had bled his features white.
He came early. Imagine that. I thought he believed in covenants, but he came early to catch me out.
Who is he?
Whitehead wiped tears from his cheeks with the heel of his hand, smearing the blood.
Bastard lied to me.
Are you hurt?
No. He wouldn't lay a hand on me. He knows better than that. He wants me to go willingly, you see.
I'll call the police.
No! Forget it. It was just a little joke. We'll clean up this little mess by ourselves. You'll do that, won't you?
I've done all I'm going to do for you.
You want to go back home, is that it? Want to go back behind bars where you can hide your head?
I've heard those threats before.
Am I getting repetitive? Oh, dear. Oh, Christ in heaven. Go on, then. Piss off. You're not in my class. What the fuck am I doing expecting you to take a stand?
You set me up.
I told you. A joke.
Not just tonight. All along. Lying to me, bribing me. You said you needed someone to trust, and then you treat me like shit. No wonder they all run out on you in the end.
All right. What do you want?
The truth.
All right, boy. All right. If you're so eager to hear, I'll tell you. Close the door. When were you born, Marty?
1948. December.
The war was over.
Yes.
You don't know what you missed. Such times. I was a thief, Marty. Well, black marketeer has a more impressive ring, I suppose, but it amounts to the same thing. Things fell my way.
You were lucky.
Luck had no bearing on it. Luck's for people with no control. I had control. Well, I didn't know it at the time. I made my own luck, if you like. You must understand, war isn't like you see in the cinema, or at least my war wasn't. Europe was falling apart. Everything was in flux.
Marty wondered where this introduction was taking them, but Whitehead was just getting into the rhythm of his telling. This was no time to divert him.
You can't conceive of it. Towards the end of the war, this was an error, really. I wound up in Warsaw. There was practically nothing left of it by the time I got there. There'd been such glories in Warsaw, you know. Fine houses, beautiful churches, great collections of paintings. So much. But by the time I arrived, it was all gone, pounded to dust. Underfoot there was muck, gray muck.
Whitehead was hunched up, his face was knotted, his hands were fists. For the first time, Marty felt, he looked his 70 years. He was in agonies. The memory of muck. More than that, the anticipation of it.
Well, while I was in Warsaw, I heard about a man who never once lost a game. A card player.
Never lost?
Yes. I was as cynical as you. I treated the stories I heard as fable. But wherever I went, I heard about him. A miracle worker. He plays all comers. I got to be curious. I thought, why does he play here, in the middle of nowhere? There can't have been much money around. Eventually, I found a soldier who played against him and, of course, lost. Lieutenant Konstantin Vasilyev.
And the card player? Did you find him as well?
Oh, yes. That's what he'd been waiting for. I see that now. All these years I pretended I was in charge, you know? that I'd gone to him, that I'd won by my own skills.
You won?
Certainly I won. But he let me. It was his way of seducing me, and it worked. He made it look difficult, of course, but I was so full of myself I never once contemplated the possibility that he'd lost the game deliberately. I mean, there was no reason for him to do that, was there? Not that I could see. Not at the time.
Why did he let you win?
I told you. Seduction.
What do you mean? He wanted you in bed?
It's possible, yes. Yes, I think it probably was a temptation, but sex is nothing, is it? I mean, as possessions go, to fuck somebody is trite stuff. What he wanted me for went far deeper and was far more permanent than any physical act.
Did you always win when you played him?
I never played against him again. That was the first and only time. I know it sounds unlikely. He was a gambler, and so was I, but he wasn't interested in cards for the betting.
It was a test.
Yes. To see if I was worthy of him. Fit to build an empire. After the war, when they started rebuilding Europe, he used to say there were no real Europeans left. They'd all been wiped out by one Holocaust or another, and he was the last of the line. I believed him. All the talk of empires and traditions. I was flattered to be lionized by him. He was more cultured, more persuasive, more penetrating than any man I had met or have met since. All that's left now is a husk, of course. But there was nothing he couldn't have been or done if he'd put his mind to it. But when I said to him, why do you bother with the likes of me? Why don't you go into politics, some sphere where you can wield power directly? He'd give me this look and say, it's all been done. I didn't realize it at first, but I think he was telling me that he'd been these people, done these things.
How's that possible? One man.
I don't know. It's all conjecture. It was from the beginning. And here I am, 40 years later, still juggling rumors.
This was to be the Last Supper. Am I right? You were going to escape before he came for you.
In a way, he taught me so much. But he prospered every bit as much as I did. He shared my houses, my friends, even my wife. Did I tell you about the lieutenant?
You mentioned him. Vasiliev?
He died. Did I tell you that?
No.
He didn't pay his debts. His body was dragged out of the sewers of Warsaw.
Mamulian killed him?
Not personally, but yes, I think... Did you hear something?
What?
No. It's all right. What was I saying?
The lieutenant?
Oh, yes. This piece of the story... I've never told anyone this. I thought if I kept my silence, sooner or later, it would disappear.
There was another noise in the hall.
The
A
night
whine like wind
Mamulian
through a
was
tiny aperture.
an incredible evening.
And then a scratching at the door.
Try and describe it.
Whitehead didn't hear it.
You know the way the
He was in
sun
Warsaw again,
catch the top
in a house with a bonfire and a room with
I
a
walked
table
through
and a
the
guttering flame. Almost like the room they were in now, but smelling of old fire rather than souring wine.
I remember when the game was over. Mamulian stood up and shook hands with me. Cold hands. Icy hands. Then a door opened behind me. I half turned to see. It was Vasiliev.
The lieutenant?
horribly burned.
He'd survived.
No. He was quite dead.
As the words faltered, the scratching began again at the door, an unmistakable appeal for entry. This time Whitehead heard it. His moment of weakness had passed, apparently. His head jerked round.
Don't answer it.
Why not?
It's him.
No, the European's gone. I saw him leave.
Not the European. It's the Lieutenant, Vasiliev.
You're being ridiculous.
No, please, Jesus, no!
Marty turned the handle and opened the door. Meager candlelight found the would-be entrant. It was Bella, the Madonna of the kennels. She stood uncertainly on the threshold. Her eyes, what was left of them, turned up to look at Marty. Her tongue a rag of maggot muscle which hung from her mouth as if she lacked the strength to withdraw it.
It isn't him.
Jesus Christ.
It's all right, Martin. It isn't him.
Close the door.
Whitehead was staring at Bella across the threshold. She shifted her head to look at him. Marty turned away, revolted, his reason thrashing around to find some sane explanation, but there was none to be had. The dog had been dead. He'd parceled her up himself. There was no question of premature burial.
She doesn't mean any harm. She used to come up here sometimes for tidbits. She was the only one of them I trusted. Vile species.
Send it away.
She's lonely.
I don't believe this is happening.
Bella had woken with an appetite. That was why she'd made her way up to the room she remembered most fondly. A place where a man who knew the best spot to scratch behind her ear would coo soft words to her and feed her morsels off her plate. But tonight she'd come up to find things had changed. The man was odd with her, and there was someone else with him in the room. She was still hungry, and there was an appetizing smell very close to her, of meat left in the earth the way she liked it, still on the bone and half gone to putrescence. She sniffed, almost blind, looking for the source of the smell, and, having found it, began to eat.
Not a pretty sight.
Bella was devouring her own body, taking gray, greasy bites from the decayed muscle of her haunch. Whitehead watched as she pulled at herself. His passivity in the face of this new horror broke Marty.
Don't let her.
But she's hungry.
Marty picked up the chair he'd been sitting on and slammed it against the wall. It was heavy, but his muscles were brimming, and the violence was a welcome release. The dog looked up from her meal. The meat she was swallowing fell from her cut throat. Marty picked up a leg of the chair and crossed the room before Bella could register what he intended. At the last moment, she seemed to understand that he meant her harm and tried to get to her feet. The force of his blow shattered her skull. The body backed off, dragging the ruined head on a rope of a neck, the tail tucked between its back legs for fear.
Enough of this, old man. Where's Karis? Where did you send him?
Poor Marty. You're more bovine than I thought you were. You won't see her again.
Why not?
She's with him, damn you. Didn't it occur to you? She went with him. Willingly, of course.
No.
Oh, yes, Marty. He had a claim on her from the beginning. He rocked her in his arms when she was barely born. I won her back, of course. I made her love me for a time. But who knows what kind of influence he has on her. She's my daughter, after all. She thinks the way I do. She went with him to learn how to use her powers. I did the same, remember?
This line of argument, even from vermin like Whitehead, made a kind of sense. Beneath her strange conversation, hadn't there always lurked a contempt for Marty and the old man alike? Contempt earned by their inability to sum her up? Given the opportunity, wouldn't Karis go dance with the devil if she felt she'd understand more of herself by doing so?
Don't concern yourself with Karis. Forget her, she's gone.
Marty tried to hold on to the image of her face, but it was deteriorating. He was suddenly very tired, exhausted to his bones.
Get some rest, Marty. Tomorrow we can clean up this mess.
I'm getting out of here.
I told you once, didn't I? If you stayed with me, there was nowhere I couldn't take you. It's more true now than ever. You know Toy's dead.
When? How?
I didn't ask the details. The point is he's gone. There's only you and I now.
You made a fool out of me.
An error of taste. Forgive me.
Too late.
Please. I don't want you to leave me. Marty, you came here to help me. What have you done? Nothing. Nothing. Please, don't leave me.
Marty stepped out into the corridor without looking back. There was a morbid surprise awaiting him. Bella, like a study of patience, was lying by her master's door. She raised her neck as Marty sidled past. What was left of her head swung in his general direction. Marty looked away, disgusted. But a rhythmical thumping made him glance back. She had forgiven him his previous violence, apparently. Content now, she stared, eyeless, at him, while her wretched tail beat gently on the carpet. Part 5. The Deluge. Out of a fired ship, which by no way but drowning could be rescued from the flame, some men leaped forth, and as they came near the foe's ships, did their shop decay. So all were lost, which in the ship were found. They in the sea being burnt, they in the burnt ship drowned. John Donne, A Burnt Ship. The city didn't welcome Marty back with open arms, but he was glad to be away from the house once and for all. Whatever the consequences of his departure in the long term, and he would have to think very carefully about whether he now turned himself in, he at least had a breathing space, time to think things through. After 2 days of liberty, his thoughts had turned to an old theme: America. He'd be safe there. Not just from the police and Mamoulian, but from history, from stories told again and again, round in circles, world without end. He had borrowed one of Whitehead's cars, but to keep himself off the streets while he planned his escape, he'd found a room in Kilburn, a dingy bed-sitting room with a bathroom 2 flights down. Still, he reassured himself it wasn't for long. He was on his way to see a forger named Raglan about getting a passport when he read about Whitehead's death. It was on the cover of the Daily Telegraph: millionaire recluse found dead at home. Beneath it, a picture of Papa, a younger, beardless Whitehead, snapped at the height of his looks and influence. The service had attracted so many onlookers, from casual observers to die-hard scandal sniffers, that Marty's presence outside the church went entirely unnoticed. There were many faces there that he recognized, however. Ottaway and Kurtzinger led the pallbearers. Dwoskin was there as well. But Marty hung back, content to watch the proceedings from a distance. Finally, Karis and Mamoulian emerged from the shade of the porch into the brilliance of the afternoon. And Marty was sure he caught the girl cautiously scanning the crowd, fearful that her companion would notice. In the road, Mamoulian was speaking to one or two of the mourners. Handshakes were exchanged, commiserations offered to Karis. Marty watched impatiently. Pleasantries and farewells exchanged, they got into the back of a dark green Rover and drove away. Marty raced to the citron. He mustn't lose her now, whatever happened. This was perhaps his last chance to locate her. In the back seat of the Rover, Karis had a strange, flickering thought. Whenever she closed her lids to blink or shut out the day's glare, a figure appeared. A runner. She recognized him in seconds. She wanted to glance over her shoulder, but she knew better. Mamoulian would guess something was going on if he hadn't already. If he entered her now, he'd see the runner for certain. Mamoulian looked across at her. She was a secret one, he thought.
It amused you?
What?
The funeral.
No. No, of course not.
You were smiling. I thought perhaps... Is he really dead, Karis? Tell me your thoughts, so I don't have to dig for them.
Please. Don't hurt me.
I think he's trying to cheat me. The closed coffin, the body to be locked in a bank vault until cremation. Is he dead, Karis?
The night he died? The night they said he died, I felt nothing. There was no change.
What do you construe from that? What do you guess?
That he isn't dead.
Oh, Pilgrim, you almost had me fooled.
Marty watched the house in Caliban Street for a long time before making his move. No dreams of America now, just the fact of the house and Karis locked up in it. The blinds of the middle windows were kept drawn all day, and the single top-story window looked to be permanently shuttered from the inside. He concluded that there were only two people in the house besides Karis. One, of course, was the European. The other was a fat, unhealthy-looking man whom Marty instantly took to be the dog killer. An unpalatable sight, with his cosmeticized features, his hobbled walk, the sly looks he gave to the children as they played. On the 5th day of his surveillance, luck came his way. At about 8:50 in the evening, a taxi drew up outside the house, and Mamoulian, dressed for the casino, got into it. Almost an hour later, the other man appeared at the front door, his face a blur in the deepening light, but hungry somehow. Marty waited until the shambling figure had disappeared around the corner of Caliban Street before he got out of the car. The waiting had once again been hard. What remained was child's play for Marty. He bought a jemmy and a torch, the standbys of any self-respecting thief, and in a few minutes he was inside. The ground floor was empty. On the second floor, he found Breer's room. It stank, an unwholesome mingling of perfume and rancid meat. On the wall were photographs torn from a book of war atrocities. He did no more than glimpse at them, but their details, even in the doubtful light, were appalling. He closed the door on the squalor and tried the next. It was the toilet. Beside that, the bathroom. The fourth and last door on this floor was tucked around a half corridor, and it was locked.
Karis. It's Marty. Can you hear me? It's Marty.
Impatience overtook him. She was there, just beyond the door. He was suddenly seized by the absolute conviction of her presence. The wood began to splinter beneath his assault. The lock cracked. He put his shoulder to the door and forced it open.
Karis! Karis!
She was lying, curled up on herself, in a corner of the room. A dim light burned in another corner. She was wearing only a t-shirt and a pair of knickers. At first, she didn't seem to recognize him.
It's me. Marty.
Marty?
Yes, it's me.
She half sat up, the t-shirt clinging to her sweaty torso. The crook of her arm was punctured and bruised.
Don't come near me.
What's wrong?
Wait. It's all right. He isn't here.
I could have told you that. He left the house 2 hours ago. Come on, let's go.
He doesn't have to be here physically. Anyway, it's no use. You must go. Leave me be.
So, Papa was right.
Papa? What did he tell you?
That you wanted to be with Mamoulian? That you wanted to be like him?
No. No, Marty, never.
Where's his room? I want to see where he sleeps. Where is it?
No, Marty, please. Just leave. This isn't a game. It's not all going to be forgiven when we come to the end. It doesn't even stop when you die. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Oh, yes. I understand. Not all of it, but enough. I've seen things. I've heard stories. I'm shit scared. I've never been so scared in my life.
You've got reason.
I'll find you dope, if that's what's keeping you here. I'll get it for you.
Did a doubt cross her face?
I saw you looking for me at the funeral.
You were there.
Why were you looking around for me if you didn't want me to come?
I thought maybe you'd gone with Papa.
Dead, you mean?
No. Gone away, wherever he's gone.
Where is he?
In an abandoned hotel about a half an hour from here. That's probably where they've gone.
Come with me. Gentle God, can't you see that I need you? Please.
I'm no use. I'm weak.
Me too. I'm weak too. We deserve each other.
Maybe we do. I'll dress.
He hugged her hard, breathing the staleness of her hair, knowing that this first victory might be his only one. She gently broke from his embrace and turned to the business of preparing to go. He watched her while she pulled on her jeans. But her self-consciousness made him leave her to it. He stepped out onto the landing.
What are you doing? You can't come up here.
Marty turned and beheld the razor eater in the dim light. He realized that he had left his Jemmy in the room where Karis had lain. He was without a weapon. Breer moved quickly, his thoughts on the girl and what Mamoulian would do to him if anything happened to her. He pushed by Marty and headed for the door.
Where is my angel? Where is the song?
Suddenly, Karis was there with the iron bar. She might never have another chance to thank Breer for his many humiliations. The first blow caught him squarely in the face, the Jemmy sinking deep into his huge skull. The second blow nearly removed his head entirely. He fell to his knees.
Come on!
This time, when Marty pulled at her, she went with him, glad of the darkness. The slosh of blood and the tattoo of Breer's feet on the floorboards were more than enough to appall. Marty and Karis slept together in his single bed. Long, rewarding sleep. If the baby in the room below cried in the night, they didn't hear it. Nor did they hear the sirens on Kilburn High Road, police and fire engines going to a conflagration in Maidavale. It wasn't until the middle of the next afternoon that they awoke and began to talk. The dialogue began quite calmly, but Karis's nervousness had escalated as she felt hungrier for a fix. Hadn't he promised to get heroin for her? Reluctantly, Marty obliged, and their conversation had continued long into the night. She told him about the time she had entered the European's body while the man was sleeping, and what she had learned about him while she was there. how a lowly sergeant had narrowly escaped having his head cut off by an executioner behind some god-forsaken front in 1811. How the monk who had saved the sergeant's life had given him ancient wisdom in exchange for a sweet, if violent, death. And how Mamoulian, as the young sergeant was called, had gone on to live too long with his dreadful secrets. When she had finished, Marty told her about his long talk with Whitehead, how the thief and the card player had met and gambled in Warsaw in the aftermath of war, and how winning that game had cost the thief his freedom, and now perhaps his life. The pieces fell neatly into place. Only where did Karis fit in? Would she ever be free of Mamoulian? Would Marty wake one night to find other eyes inside her eyes, looking at him with hatred? And what price would he be called upon to pay for wrecking the Europeans' plans? Marty knew that they had to finish it now. Hell is reimagined by each generation. Its terrain is surveyed for absurdities and remade in a fresher mold. Its terrors are scrutinized and, if necessary, reinvented to suit the current climate of atrocity. In a wasteland a few hundred yards from a motorway flyover, it finds new incarnation. Shabby, degenerate, forsaken. But here, where fumes thicken the atmosphere, minor terrors take on a new brutality. Heaven, by night, would have all the configurations of hell. No less the Orpheus, hereafter called Pandemonium Hotel.
Your deal, I believe.
Ah, yes. Warsaw. Have you ever been back? Terrible what they did.
The Germans?
The city planners.
I think you're cheating.
For only the
You'd know
second
if I was.
time in their long association,
tricks
the
are
two men
usually
sat
yours.
facing each other over the
come
table
now.
and played blackjack.
Everything I learned
The
about
game was
cheating,
uneventful.
I learned from you.
They were, it seemed, more evenly matched than they'd been in Muranovsky Square 40-odd years before. The talk, too, was calm and undramatic. Only once did the chat show its true colors, escalating from a simple remark to metaphysics in mere seconds.
Even now.
Even now what?
You're still cheating, aren't you? You shouldn't be alive, not at your age.
It's true.
You look the way you did in Warsaw, give or take a scar. What age are you? 100? 150?
Older.
And what's it done for you? You're more afraid than I am. You need someone to hold your hand while you die. And you chose me.
Together, we might never have died.
Oh?
We might have founded worlds.
I doubt it.
It was all appetite then, from the beginning?
Most of it.
You never cared to make sense of it all?
Sense? There's no sense to be made. You told me that. The first lesson. It's all chance. You lose again.
Yes.
Another game?
Just one more. Then we really must be going.
At the head of the stairs, Marty halted. The door of Whitehead's suite was slightly ajar. There was a murmur of voices from inside. He motioned to the darkness below, and presently Karis joined him on the landing. Together, they advanced along the hallway and took up stations outside the door. They could see the players now, locked in quiet contest. One was Whitehead, the other Mamoulian. Marty signaled to Karis to stay where she was and stepped into the room. Then the madness began.
Ah, it is Strauss.
Marty felt an icy finger at the nape of his neck, and pain shot down his spine. Somehow Mamoulian had expected a late arrival at the celebrations, Who it was to be, he hadn't foreseen. Marty was falling to his knees.
You see that, Joseph? We will not go alone after all. And where is our dear Caris?
From his collapsed position on the floor, Marty gazed up at the last European. The air between them seemed to be itching. Marty waited. Surely the death stroke would follow quickly. But there was nothing. Even in his anguished state, Marty could see the tragedy written in the mask of Mamulian's face. It no longer terrified him. It simply fascinated. This man was the source of the nullity he had barely survived at the Last Supper. Was there not a ghost of that gray air lurking in his sockets now, seeping from his mouth and nostrils as though a fire smoldered in his cranium? Caris stepped into the doorway.
You brought him here!
She didn't reply. Whitehead, who had been standing utterly still until this moment, began to move stealthily across to the pillow of his makeshift bed. Events by the doorway had shifted the focus for a useful moment. He slipped his hand beneath the pillow and drew out a gun. From where he stood, Mamulian would be an easy target, except that Caris was standing right in front of him. Would a bullet fired at his back pass through him and into her? The thought, though appalling, had to be contemplated. Survival was at issue here.
Joseph!
Whitehead's hand froze as he felt invisible fingers plucking at the nape of his neck. He ignored the pressure.
I'm not afraid. You hear me, you soulless bastard? I am not afraid.
The shot hit Mamulian's cheek. Blood came. Before Whitehead could fire again, Mamulian retaliated.
There are no limits to what I shall do.
The thought caught Whitehead by the throat and twisted. The old man's limbs convulsed. The gun flew out of his hand. His bladder and bowels failed him. Whitehead fell against the wall. The European moved in for the coup de grace.
Leave him!
Distracted, Mamulian turned towards her. The blood on his cheek had traced a single line to his jaw.
You two, no limits!
He looked at Caris with hunger in his eyes. There was an appetite on him, an instinctive response to his blood loss, and all he could see in her was nourishment.
I know who you are. You're nothing. You're just a soldier who met a monk and strangled him in his sleep. What have you got to be so proud of? You're nobody. Nobody and nothing.
The European's eyes widened, smoky. He reached to grab hold of her.
Oh, God help me!
Her senses crumbled and grayness streamed in to take their place. He pulled her out of her body with one insolent wrench and took her into him, dropping her husk to the floor beside the overturned table. Wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, Mamulian headed for the bathroom to attend to his wound. Cautiously, Marty got up and crossed the room to where Whitehead lay. The old man took hold of his shirt.
You've got to fetch her. Fetch her, Marty.
What are you talking about?
He has her. In him. Fetch her, for Christ's sake. Or she'll be there forever, like the others. Can't let him have her, boy. You hear me?
Whitehead's eyes rolled back in his skull, and he was gone. Marty had difficulty sewing the sense of his last words together. Fetch her? How? He closed his eyes, shutting out the room, and Whitehead lying there with his neck broken. He tried to imagine her, to dream her, not knowing how to do it, but wanting to. The air still tingled with the energy the European had used to hold them still. Caris was there. He had to keep that thought uppermost. A touchstone. Marty hadn't realized how pleasurable the experience of travel had been. A passenger of pure thought. Until he plunged into Mamulian's body. He felt like a skinned man immersed in boiling oil. Karis was there, he told himself. Go deeper. Deeper than you'd dare go. So much deeper.
Huh? Oh, no.
Mamoulian shook his head. It was full of strange aches. Voices, too. Or was it just the past chattering to him? Yes, the past. It had buzzed and gossiped in his ear more loudly in these past weeks than ever in the preceding decades. Something moved in the room behind him. He looked into the mirror and glimpsed a shapeless figure looming over Whitehead and the bodyguard. As Mamoulian turned, it flashed across his mind that Strauss's body was not where he had left it. He stepped into the room, and Breer turned to face him. Only he had no face. The European's stomach rebelled at the mingled stench of sandalwood and putrefaction. He looked down at the machete Breer was carrying.
Why did you come? Have you come to be killed? Is that it?
Breer shook what was left of his head. He had no such intention, and Mamoulian knew it. Death was the least of his problems. He raised the blade at his side to signal his intentions.
I can wipe you out.
His mind revolted at the thought of laying his flesh on such decay. He looked around for a weapon. It was an error. The dead man swung the machete and found Mamoulian's shoulder.
Stop!
Breer shook his head again. This is what he had come for, wasn't it?
Limb from limb, if I must. Limb from limb.
He moved suddenly, his good hand snatching at Breer's throat before the other had a chance to retaliate. The European's slender fingers dug through the mush and closed around Breer's esophagus. Then he pulled hard. A goodly portion of Breer's neck came away, and a splutter of grease and fluids. Mamoulian flung the fistful of muck away. Despite his formidable injury, the Razor Eater was still standing.
Must I tear you apart?
Even as he spoke, something scrabbled inside him. Was it the girl still fighting her confinement?
Who's there?
I'm here. I'm with you.
Karis answered, not to Mamoulian, but to Marty. He heard her. No, not heard, felt. She summoned him. He followed. For the frailest of moments, he caught the intention of her words. They were together, and together they were more than a sum of their parts. His mind jubilated. She was with him, he with her. They were one indivisible thought, imagining each other.
No!
And hell divided. It had no choice. The province fragmented as they delivered themselves of the Europeans' grasp. They experienced a few exquisite moments as one mind. And then gravity, or whatever law pertained in this state, demanded its lot. Division came, a rude expulsion from this momentary Eden, and they were plummeting towards their own bodies, the conjunction over. Mamoulian felt their escape as a wounding more traumatic than anything Breer had so far delivered. He put his fingers up to his mouth, a look of pitiful loss on his face. Breer seemed to sense a cue in this. His moment had come. The machete in his hand felt heavier by the second, more like an axe. He raised it. Its shadow fell across the European's face. Mamoulian looked at Breer's ruined features and saw how it had all come to this moment. Bowed under a weight of years, he fell to his knees. As he was doing so, Karis opened her eyes. There had been a vile, grinding return, more terrible for Marty than for herself, who was used to the sensation. But it was never entirely pleasant to feel muscle and fat congeal around the spirit. Marty opened his eyes, too. He looked across to Karis for reassurance, but her attention was claimed by a sight concealed from Marty by Whitehead's body beside him. She was watching a spectacle she knew from somewhere. It took her a moment to place the scene. A man on his knees, his neck exposed, his arms spread a little from his body, fingers splayed in the universal gesture of submission. The executioner, face blurred, raising the blade to decapitate his willing victim. A sergeant named Mamoulian, awaiting the blow that would cancel his young life. A blow that had never come, or rather, had been deferred until now. The act, begun a second time, was not to be postponed again. Mamoulian made no sound. Marty raised himself and stumbled across the room as Breer began to berate the open wound of the corpse's neck with the machete. Karras, flattened against the wall beside the door, caught Marty's hand.
Paul! What about Paul?
No use. He's gone. And we should go too.
The dead man worked at his grim business for a good time. Long after the domestic traffic on the motorway had dwindled to a trickle, leaving only the long-distance freight drivers to roar their way north, Breer heard none of it. He finished dividing and subdividing the flesh of the European, until at last it was impossible to tell apart the piece that spoke and the piece that pissed. I'm the last of the tribe, thought Breer, as he set fire to the room. When I'm gone, the razor eaters will be a thing of the past. When at last the flames went out, the dogs came to scavenge as best they could in what remained of Pandemonium Hotel. More than one of them went away yelping, however, their palates slit by a mouthful of meat in which, secreted like pearls, were the razor blades Breer had downed like a gourmet. Wind had the world. It blew exactly east-west that evening, carrying the clouds buoyant after a day of rain in the direction of the setting sun, as if they were hurrying to some apocalypse just over the horizon. Karras tried to convince Marty that all was well, but she was having more than a little difficulty. He held her close to him all the way across London, more for his comfort than for hers. The wind buffeted them, as antagonistic as ever. Marty looked up to see if the wind had blown the stars off course, but they were steadfast. Everything was in its place, despite the insanity that had mauled their lives of late. There were no revelations to be found in the sky, just pinpricks of light in a plain heaven. But he saw for the first time how fine that was. That in a world too full of loss and rage, they be remote, the minimum of glory. As she led him across the lightless ground, time and time again, he could not prevent his gaze from straying skyward.
You've been listening to The Damnation Game by Clive Barker.